Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of the comprehensive news analysis with the first article that talks about the Indian diplomacy and how is it trying to minimize the damage caused at the international level due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The author here is a former diplomat himself, so knows about how the diplomatic relations between India and the other countries usually exist in the world. Mr. Rakesh Sood talks about something called the Dikshit principle. Now, let me tell you in advance, if you Google something like Dikshit principle, you will not really find it. So, it is not really a principle or a doctrine that we have been following openly. What the author is trying to do is, he is giving an example of Mr. Jyotindra Nath Dikshit, who was a former Foreign Secretary of the Government of India between December 1991 and till Jan 1994. The author here says that during the tenure of Mr. Dikshit, when he was a Foreign Secretary of India, the Government of India took a lot of proactive steps globally to improve India's relationship with many foreign powers, including China, Israel and US. And all these relations are now giving rich dividends to India right now. He says that the same policy that Mr. Dikshit followed at that point of time should be followed even today. That is, India must change its global policy stand, keeping in mind what is happening globally. For example, if right now we are not voting in favor of or against Russia, that should be keeping in mind the global scenario at present. Rather than coming under any kind of pressure from the Western nations or the other nations across the world to vote for or against Russia, we should only look into our own national interest. The author here gives an example that when Mr. Dikshit was India's Foreign Secretary, India was in a very crucial phase. That was a time that the USSR had just fallen. That means India's largest and the strongest friend had just disintegrated, and India now had to open up new embassies and build individual relationships with all those smaller nations that were earlier a part of the USSR. That was also a phase when India established its full diplomatic relationship with Israel in 1992. A relationship that has grown extremely powerfully in the past couple of decades, with Israel now cooperating with India on a number of issues including defense and other technologies. Similarly, at the same time in Jan 1992, P.V. Narasimha Rao had a bilateral meeting with the US President, that is George W. Bush, which laid the foundation of India-US nuclear deal that was signed a couple of decades later when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. But the foundation of that deal was made with this 1992 meeting that again was arranged during the tenure of Mr. Dikshit. Similarly, 1992 Indian government came up with a Look East policy that ensured that India relooks at the South Asian region, specifically the ASEAN nation, which has now resulted in the ASEAN grouping becoming one of the largest trading partners with India. All these achievements of India's foreign policy came when Mr. Dikshit was India's Foreign Secretary. Thus, he was a master of his craft, and there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the way that he took his decisions as per the author. The other examples of achievement during Mr. Dikshit's tenure, as per the author, is India's relationship with China. In 1993, the two sides initiated the first of many confidence-building measures. There was an agreement signed on maintenance of peace and tranquility. Not just this, we were able to manage Taiwan and China together at the same time. Taiwan, in fact, opened up its first office in Mumbai and then shifted it to Delhi a few years later. All these decisions were taken by the Government of India with the advice of Mr. Dikshit. The author here, in fact, had the privilege of working under Mr. Dikshit when he was a diplomat. He said that Mr. Dikshit's point always, while making any important decision, was that you may appear in different forms to the others, but you have to first secure your own interest. In simple words, national interest is over everything else. It might impact your image at the international level for short or long term, but whatever is in your national interest will always be the correct decision in going forward. And in this context, we must see how India is responding in the UN about the resolutions that are being introduced against Russia. India usually has been abstaining from all those resolutions, mainly because, as per the author, when a country votes for or against in such a resolution, it is seen as a blunt support or opposition of the country that is involved. It is either entirely white or entirely black. On the other hand, abstaining from voting, as India is doing, is in a grey zone. which gives the opportunity and the time to India to maintain relationship from both the sides. Because India right now has too much to lose by taking one side, that is either the Western nations or Russia, because we want to maintain good relationship with both the sides. In the ongoing case with India abstaining from voting, Indian diplomats have the opportunity of explaining their stand to both the sides, to Russia also and to the West also, which is what we have been doing right now. And as per the author, this is the correct decision going forward if you see it from the eyes of Mr. Dikshit's decisions. Now, whenever we talk about India's foreign policy and Indian diplomacy, one of the aspects that we used to overlook is the budget that we have given for our diplomacy. India often has been criticized around the world for not having enough diplomats as compared to the other countries that are of our size. In fact, the number of Indian diplomats going around the world are very, very small in proportion to other countries, let's say China or US or even Russia. In fact, the budget also that is given to our external ministry that looks into the expenses of the diplomats is not very high. For instance, there was a 5% decline in the expenditure allocated to the external ministry for the financial year 2022-23. Now, decline in this budget means many things. Number one, we can't have a lot of diplomats. Secondly, this kind of diplomacy means that India needs to give financial help to smaller countries in the neighborhood. For example, every year we give some financial aid to nations such as Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, etc. Then there is Afghanistan. But when we have a lower budget for the external ministry, means all those programs that the government of India has been running to assist those nations have to be curtailed. In fact, in December 2021, there was a report tabled in the Parliamentary Standing Committee which observed that the budget given to the Ministry of External Affairs is just 0.5% of the government of India's budget. That is extremely, extremely low when you compare it with other countries around the world. India allocated 8,133 crore for loans and grants to foreign governments for 2022-23. Considering that India has high aspirations and we want to make the best of our relationship with the foreign powers and with the neighbors, this sum is extremely meager. In fact, there was a drop in allocation of India's aid to foreign nations, about a 12% decline from 2021 as compared to 2022. That also has got to do with India's extra expenditure due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but that has impacted India's relationship with the smaller nations. For example, there has been a significant downward revision when it comes to our aid to Bhutan. Initially, we allocated about 3,000 crore rupees of aid to Bhutan, and now it has been revised to only 1755 crore rupees, which would have an impact on our relationship with Bhutan in some way or the other. And it's not just about the budget. It is also about the manpower that we have. The number of diplomats that we have employed specifically to put India's point across at international levels. Let me give you a graph to show you how much we are lagging as compared to other countries. Look at this. India has almost the same number of diplomats around the world as compared to New Zealand. Now, do you know how much is the population of New Zealand? By a rough estimate, the population of New Zealand is about 50 lakh. Just imagine, 50 lakh. Consider this, that Delhi's population is well over 2 crores right now. Just Delhi's population. And see the comparison of how many diplomats that we have employed. See countries such as Japan, UK, Australia, which have a much lesser population as compared to India, but the number of people employed in their foreign services are much, much more. And that is why they have been able to make such a strong impact when it comes to international diplomacy and international lobbying as well. This is also one area where we have to work very hard. The next article is the Karnataka High Court judgment on the issue of whether or not wearing a hijab is an essential practice of Islamic religion or not. Now, many of you have been asking us to discuss this issue, and we have been holding it back specifically because the matter was in the court. Now, since the court judgment has come out in this article, we will specifically and strictly only discuss the pointers given by the Karnataka High Court and not any additional view from our end or from someone else's end. Now, as you know, yesterday, the Karnataka High Court in its judgment upheld the ban on wearing of hijab by the students in schools and colleges within the state of Karnataka. Now, the Karnataka High Court had to answer multiple questions. The first question that they had to answer was, whether wearing a hijab is an essential religious practice as per Islam or not, because if it is, then it should be guaranteed under Article 25. Secondly, they also had to answer whether is it a legal and constitutional right of the education institutions to decide a uniform for the students of the education institutions or not. These are some of the questions that the Karnataka High Court had to answer. The Karnataka High Court judgment was given by a 3-judge bench. It was headed by the Chief Justice Rituraj Avasthi, then there was Justice Krishna S. Dikshit, and then there was Justice J. M. Khazi. Also, it was a unanimous judgment. Means it was not that one judge had one view and the other judges had some other view. All 3 judges had the same view. The bench said that the Karnataka government's order that was given on the 5th of February that prescribed guidelines for uniforms in schools and pre-university colleges is as per the law, and the government is allowed to impose school uniforms. The court also said in the 129-page judgment that the school uniform will cease to be a uniform if hijab is also allowed as a part of this uniform. Now, there are multiple articles given in the newspaper today on this particular judgment. None of them covers the entire judgment because it's a 129-page judgment. So what we have done is we have taken important pointers from the court judgment and we have tried to analyze what exactly is the point that the Karnataka High Court has made in the judgment. The bench of the Karnataka High Court has said that the restriction that is put on hijab is reasonable, and that is why it is allowed as per the constitution, because Article 25, that is the fundamental right to practice and profess your religion, comes with certain restrictions that should be reasonable, and not wearing a hijab is a part of reasonable restrictions as per the Karnataka High Court. The court said there is no material placed on record prima facie that shows that wearing of a hijab is a part of an essential religious practice in Islam, and that is why the students or the petitioners should not say that it is a fundamental right that they have. In fact, in the end of the judgment, the court also says that while this uniform code was existing since 2004, we are surprised why this matter had come up all of a sudden. The court in fact said that there are unseen hands behind this controversy and they should be put to justice as soon as possible. The court said that we are in a state where Muslims in great numbers participate in Hindu festivals also. For example, Muslims participate in festivals such as the Ash Mat Sampradaya, which is the ideals on the basis of which the Indian society rests. And these kind of controversies go against these ideals and thus they should be stopped as soon as possible. On the question of whether it is a part of Article 25 or not, the court said that Article 25 that allows the freedom of conscience, faith and religion, and Article 19 that allows your freedom of speech and expression have certain restrictions that can be imposed on them by the state. But the petitioner said, that is the student side, that the restrictions can be imposed by the government, that is fine. But the restriction should only be public order, health and morality. And in the case of hijab, none of these restrictions are valid. But the court said that no, that is not true. The restriction of not being allowed to wear a hijab over the uniform is considered as a reasonable restriction and we will allow. The court in fact said that Article 25 is not as important as some of the other fundamental rights that we have. The court said that Article 25 itself starts with the restrictions that have been imposed on it. And thus people who are arguing that we have the right to profess our religion under Article 25 must understand that this cannot come at the cost of public order, and this cannot come at the cost of obstructing the usual practices that are followed inside education institutions. Now, if you go even deeper into the judgment that is available online, it's just a 129-page judgment. So if you're really interested in this, you can go through it. The court has said that we are relying on the commentary of the Quran by a famous Indian jurist, that is Mr. Abdullah Yusuf Ali. Now, the question was that some people said that we are interpreting Quran in a way that it says that wearing a hijab is mandatory, while the other people said that Quran is to be interpreted in the way in which wearing a hijab is not compulsory. The judges here have relied on the interpretation of the Holy Quran by this famous Indian jurist, according to whom not every activity associated with religion is an essential religious practice. The court said that wearing a hijab is not fundamental to the Islamic law and it's not a cornerstone of this religion. In fact, Mr. Abdullah Yusuf Ali in his commentaries of the Holy Quran has said that hijab is not even referred to in Quran. Also in the Holy Quran, wearing a hijab is only recommendatory. There is no penalty given for not wearing a hijab, which means that it is not a part of the compulsory religious practices. In fact, wearing of hijab was recommended in the earlier times in the medieval period because it was a form of social security for the women, because we were living in barbaric times when women had to take care of themselves and had to protect against the evil in the society. And the same issue does not exist right now as per the code. That is why the practice of wearing this apparel has to do more with culture and not really with religion as per the court's detailed order. The court said by unanimous judgment that there has to be a very delicate balance maintained between the collective rights of the community at large and the individual rights of the members, and thus ended the court's judgment. Obviously, the petitioner's side, that is the students, don't agree with this, and some of them have already approached the Supreme Court. So very soon we might see the matter being listed at the Supreme Court level as well, and we see if there is any change in the judgment given by the apex court or not. The next article that we have here takes us back to Taliban, an issue that we had forgotten ever since the Ukraine-Russia crisis had started. In simple terms, the author here is saying that ever since Taliban took over the country of Afghanistan, they just had one single friend, that was Pakistan. And they were hoping that the countries around the world will start to recognize the Taliban government because Pakistan will convince them to. They were hoping that Pakistan will improve its relationship with the US and other Western nations, and in return, these Western nations and the US will now try to legitimize the Taliban government. But over the past month or so, we have not seen that happen. In fact, the opposite has happened. In the past month or so, we have seen how the Pakistan government is trying to come in the Russia-China camp. So much so that Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Russia and did not say anything about this ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine. This has in fact created a further divide between Pakistan and Western countries, including the US, thus dashing the hopes of Taliban that Pakistan will act as a bridge between them and the American government. In fact, Taliban right now is in a dire need of economic assistance from European nations and from US. But with all the attention of these nations going towards Ukraine and Russia, Taliban in Afghanistan is feeling left out with not many options now in its own hands. As the article says, that Pakistan trying to come closer to Russia will dampen the chances of Taliban getting international recognition because USA is not listening to Pakistan anymore. Secondly, the situation in Afghanistan itself has become pretty complex and uncertain. Ever since Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan again, the Afghan people are facing shortage of food, medical supplies, cash, etc. While in the month of February, the US president did announce that we are taking back some of the sanctions, but they are not enough. In fact, earlier when the American government had seized assets worth $7 billion of Afghanistan that were placed in the Western banks, that has been hurting the Afghanistan Taliban government till now. And no action has been taken on that regard by the Western nations to ease out those difficulties for Taliban government. And the one single friend of Taliban, that is Pakistan, is not really paying a lot of attention to them. In fact, Pakistan is trying to display a tilt towards Russia diplomatically. Now, although we have been talking a lot about how India has been voting, just to give you an idea, in all the UN resolutions, in fact, Pakistan also has been abstaining from voting. They have not voted against Russia. They are voting exactly in the same manner as India is doing. And this is not just bad news for the Taliban, it is also bad news for the common citizens of Afghanistan as well. Ever since the Taliban took over Afghanistan, a lot of Afghan citizens have been trying to flee the country and they are refugees right now in many of the European nations. But as expected, the other European countries will more likely prefer the refugees coming in from Ukraine and pay them more attention and respect as compared to people who are coming in from Afghanistan. Thus, in short, Afghanistan is facing loss of foreign aid, severe drought, currency crisis, and much more, with no country in sight to help them out right now. So much so that the acting interior minister of Taliban made a statement that the international community should not view his government as a threat. In fact, he emphasized the fact that the country of Afghanistan needs foreign aid to revive the country, especially from the US. Taliban said that we are still committed to following the Doha agreement signed with the US, and we are not a threat to the US or any other sovereign country in Europe, and that is why we should be held by other nations and not overlooked. However, with a new axis emerging, that is Islamabad and Moscow, it remains to be seen whether Pakistan is even interested in talking to Taliban. Now, this is interesting for India also and other Western nations also. That is the new emerging axis around the world: Pakistan, China, and Russia. Now, these three obviously are not equal countries, but China has been playing a very important role to bring Pakistan closer to Russia. So much so that Imran Khan even accepted on a television interview that China played a major role in Imran Khan being invited to visit Russia recently. With this invitation, Imran Khan had become the first foreign leader to visit Russia after Russia had recognized two of the regions of Ukraine as independent republics. The last Prime Minister of Pakistan to visit the country was in 1999, where Nawaz Sharif was invited in Russia. The one other thing that is common between these three countries is that their individual relationship with the US has been declining over the past few years, and that is what finds a common thread amongst these three nations. Also, the situation has changed quite a bit since the Cold War. When the Cold War was ongoing, Pakistan was an open ally of the US and was against the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War, Pakistan realized that the US might not be the country that will support Pakistan over India. And on the other hand, Russia also realized that now they can't really be away from Pakistan, especially because they want more countries to which they can sell their weapons. Pakistan, on the other hand, was ready to buy weapons from Russia, and that is when Russia found a new market in Pakistan. In fact, all of this happened at around the same time that US-Pakistan relationship started to decline, especially under the Obama administration, with the killing of Osama bin Laden inside Pakistan without any information being given to the Pakistani government. And at the same time, Russia was also trying to sell its stuff to Pakistan. In 2011, in fact, Russia lifted its 4-decade-old policy of not supplying any arms to Pakistan and started selling their MiG attack helicopters to Pakistan without even taking India into confidence. In 2016, after Jaish-e-Mohammed had attacked Uri, India showed its displeasure over the planned Russia-Pakistan joint military exercise. But still, Russia went ahead with the joint military exercise with Pakistan, ignoring our appeal. And since then, the military relationship between Pakistan and Russia have only improved, thus highlighting the fact that India also can't blindly depend on Russia, and we have to also diversify our own interests. Now, what is it that the two sides want from each other? We know that Russia wants a new market for its oil and gas and weapons. Pakistan, on the other hand, wants any country from where they can take money by any means possible, because they're in such a bad position right now financially. So the two sides right now have these short-term objectives. Pakistan wants Russia to invest and to build a $2.5 billion gas pipeline from Seaport in Karachi to Kasur in Punjab, even though this pipeline might not be feasible for Russian gas. Moscow, on the other hand, is more interested in the Tapi pipeline project, that is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, a project that has been delayed for a very long time because Pakistan and India do not seem to go hand in hand for this project. But with China playing as a mediator between the two countries, it is expected that the relationship between the two countries would improve in the coming years. The next article that we have focuses on the Indian government's solar capacity, the milestones that we have achieved in a short span of time, and the challenges that we are still facing in this aspect. The article here says that in the last 12 months, India added a record 10 gigawatts of solar energy capacity, which is the highest ever, and it's a 200% growth year on year. Now India has surpassed 50 gigawatts of solar capacity installed, and we are in line to achieve our aim of 300 gigawatts solar power generation by 2030. However, there are still some concerns if you look deeper into the data. For example, out of the 50 gigawatt solar power installed capacity, 42 gigawatts, so over 80%, that is about 84%, is only from ground mounted solar photovoltaic systems, and only 6.5 gigawatts are from the rooftop solar system, that is the RTS. This RTS component is extremely low because we were hoping that as individuals and small businesses embrace the solar power generation, we were hoping that this RTS component will be much higher. Because for installing these rooftop solar power plants, you don't have to buy a new land. There are existing infrastructure over the top of which you will put the solar power plants. But because we are not seeing a really high jump here, that means people are still hesitant before installing this solar installation at their rooftop. In fact, government's target was that by the end of 2022, that is by the end of the ongoing year, we should have 40 gigawatts of rooftop solar capacity. But when you compare it with the present number, it's very low. That is only 6.5 gigawatts. Now, there are a lot of benefits of solar photovoltaic technology. The biggest benefit is that you don't really have to transmit power. For example, if I have a house and I want my house to run on solar energy, I can just put these solar generators on the rooftop. So there is no energy transmission that is required. We don't have to put up wires, we don't have to put up electricity poles, etc. So there is no transmission loss, there is less infrastructure, there is less financing that is required. But the problem is that the cost initially of setting up these solar installations is high, and limited financing thus is not really attracting residential consumers or the SMEs who even want to install these rooftop solar power plants. Even the electricity distribution companies have not really been supporting the net metering of the solar power connection, and that is why the response overall has not been as much as we had expected. There are other challenges as well. For instance, we might be increasing our solar power capacity, but if you look at the proportion of power that we are producing from solar, it is still very, very low as compared to some of the other nations. For example, in 2019-20, solar power only contributed 3.5% of India's total power generation. In fact, there are other challenges also in the solar sector, including high land costs. You have to acquire a lot of land to set up these solar power plants. High transmission and distribution losses if you have to transmit electricity made by solar. And there are other inefficiencies as well, because we have to integrate the solar power on the same infrastructure, the same poles and wires that we had set up for orthodox electricity. That would also require a lot of time, technology and investment. Another issue is that while we are generating solar electricity at a lower cost as compared to most other countries, the consumer at the end of the chain is still paying higher amount of money only. So people who are consuming solar power are still paying high amount of money. They're still paying the same bill as they used to pay for electricity generated from other sources. So the promise of cheaper power for the end consumer has not really been fulfilled. One of the reasons why the growth of solar power has not been that high, and the reason why these are still expensive to put, is that India does not really produce a lot of components that are required to make these solar panels. So much so that in 2021-22, we imported about $76.6 billion worth of solar cells and modules alone from China. About 78.6% of India's total imports of that year. What India rather should do is to adopt a circular economy. Circular economy means that waste material from one solar plant should be used in the next one. So there should be a circle of supply chain that should be formed. The other problem that we will face in the future, and we are not facing right now, is the increasing solar waste. Because solar panels have a life of 20-25 years. Once the 20-25 years of India beginning solar power generation are over, we will see a lot of solar waste being generated, and we don't really have a specific policy to tackle that waste. It is expected that by the end of 2030, India will produce about 34,600 metric tons of solar photovoltaic waste. We can recover a lot of material from this waste, so much so that it will have a value of $15 billion. But for that, we need to have skills, technology and investment. So far, it is only the European Union that has a concrete policy about how to manage their solar waste. Other nations across the world, including India, are lagging in this regard. Now, as I said, the issue of solar waste will eventually come up and we will have to face this problem. The reason why we are not facing this problem right now is that solar panels have a life of 20 to 25 years. So once this 20-25 period is over, only then we will start to see this problem, and we'll have to be prepared for it in advance. There are a lot of precious elements that can be extracted from this waste only and only if we have the required skills. Some of the examples using which we can learn are the examples of European Union, UK, US, Japan, South Korea. For example, in UK, they have an industry managed take back and recycling scheme under which the photovoltaic producer companies will need to register and submit data related to their products which are used for residential solar market and non-residential market. So they alone will have the responsibility to recycle this. Similarly, in US, while they don't have a federal law right now about recycling, there are some states who have defined the policies to address this solar waste management system specifically. The leader, however, in this regard is the European Union. They have the Waste, Electric and Electronic Equipment Directive, which has imposed a responsibility of disposing this waste on the manufacturer or the distributor themselves. They will be the one who will collect, handle and treat these modules once their life cycle ends. So it is not the responsibility of the government and not the responsibility of the end user as well. The next article is about the recent incident that you would have heard, that an accidental missile was launched from the Indian side and entered the Pakistani side and it crashed there. It was on 9th of March when there was a routine maintenance and inspection going on, during which a missile was accidentally released and it landed in the Pakistani territory. Now, how it came in the news was because there was a press conference held by the Pakistani military late on Thursday, in which they said that they have tracked a supersonic surface-to-surface missile that took off from the Indian territory and it entered the Pakistani territory. Now, thankfully, no one was hurt. The reason was this missile did not really had any payload on it. So there was no bomb, etc. on it. It was just a missile, just like a rocket. So wherever the missile would have fallen, it would have destroyed the infrastructure, but it would not have exploded because it did not really have a bomb on this. Now, thankfully, both the sides have handled this particular incident with a lot of maturity and thinking, and no retaliation has been seen from the Pakistani side as well. The Pakistani Air Force has said that they have taken requisite tactical actions as per their standard operating procedures, but obviously they have not revealed the details. Now, this raises a lot of questions about the procedures which are in place to avoid this kind of an incident from happening again. Pakistan obviously was not happy. They in fact summoned the Indian High Commissioner, who is in Pakistan right now, twice and said that they are not happy with this. Now, India, ever since we became the member of the MTCR, as you know, India has been working to extend the range of the BrahMos missile. Earlier, the range of the BrahMos missile was only 290 km. Now, it is being extended to over 500 kilometers as well. And that is why there are continuous tests of the BrahMos missiles that have been going on at multiple locations in India. This seems to be an incident related to one of those routine tests that may have been going on. Now, there are certain provisions in place to avoid such an incident from happening. Let me tell you what these are. So, the two countries have signed an agreement in 2005. This is called Pre-Notification of Flight Testing of Ballistic Missile Agreement. Under this, both the countries have agreed that they will give an advance notification on the flight test if it is taking place by a land or a sea surface-to-surface ballistic missile. Before the test, there would be notice to air missions and navigational warning given to alert if there are any pilots around or if there are any ships going around in the sea, so that both sides can be alerted. The agreement also says that the country who is testing the missile should ensure that the launch site is not within 40 kilometers and the planned impact area should not be within 75 kilometers of the international boundary or the line of control. Also, the planned trajectory should not cross the international border and maintain a horizontal distance of at least 40 kilometers from the border. This notice to the other nation should be given at least 3 days in advance, and there should be a 5-day window under which the flight test can be taken. Now, what are these two notices? The first, as we discussed, is notice to air missions. That is an information that is given to the flight operations so that in the nearby area, if there are some flights that are flying on the same trajectory, they can take notice. For example, Pakistan also in their press conference said that this failed or accidental launch of the Indian missile system could have endangered civilian aircraft in its way, but thankfully that did not happen. The second kind of warning is called Navigational Warning Service, that is WWNWS. This stands for Worldwide Navigational Warning System and had first come up in 1977. This again is to provide early information about such incidents, specifically to the ships that are in the sea in the nearby areas. These warnings are usually temporary but can be in force for several weeks. For example, when the Ukraine-Russia crisis is going on, so the water bodies that are nearby that area would be given this warning system. So any ship that is in that area can take notice of that and can change their. These are the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. A couple of practice questions now. What are some of the challenges India is facing while expanding its solar power capacity? Suggest possible ways to overcome the same. Second, how is the Indian concept of secularism different as compared to the Western form of secularism? Why are these differences essential in the context of Indian societal composition? Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.